for better game design. Really sad that I couldn't be there in Poznan along with many old friends, but yeah, here we are. So who am I? I'm Ranko Trivkovic. I often go by Grandpa Tiger, and I come from backgrounds of game design and writing. I was a game journalist and a novelist and a creative writing teacher, but also I was a game designer and game producer. And then since I realized that my superpower, or one of my superpowers, is structural analysis, I've decided to go full narrative designer and to help game developers and teams to craft better games through crafting better narratives. Well, why did I put the TM on the narrative designer? Because it seems that nowadays game writers who are very underappreciated in the gaming industry, I'm not going to say it's their fault or not, but it seems that a lot of people nowadays go by narrative designer when they mean game writers. So basically, yeah, I'm a narrative designer, or nowadays, as I try to go by narrative consultant, because most of my work comes from teaching writers how to make games, teaching game developers the principles of narratives, as well as provide trainings and consultations for solo developers and developer studios. Also, my marketing manager will kill me if I don't mention that Grandpa's Narrative Design is part of the Red Viking Game Studio, where we deal with mostly narrative games, but also edutainment titles. Another thing, stay tuned, because in the Q&A session, I'll be handing out keys, 6-month keys for Artisy Draft. It's a very cool mapping and narrative design tool, basically like a visual database. And it's really helpful for narrative design structures and maps in particular. So with that said, let's get down to business. So first of all, I would like to discuss what is writing for a game versus writing a game. What's the difference and why is it important? I mean, the difference is quite subtle, but it's there and it matters. So, typical example of writing a game is not limited only to these genres like game books, interactive fiction, visual novels, or adventure games. And I mean adventure games as a genre, like point and click games. But it's also stands right for all the games where narrative elements are laid out first, with gameplay coming second. Or in some cases, like with these genres, reading is the gameplay, is a part of the gameplay. So for example, if the player reads and then makes some choices or makes some decisions based on what they've read, or I don't know, do some puzzles or exploration, that's basically what I mean by writing a game. And these games, these narrative games, are anchored, so to speak, to the theme and plot continuum. So in essence, the theme of the narrative and how it translates into a plot is what creates the immersion, what creates the basics of the game, because it's about what do you want to say, what do you want to express. We play these kind of games for their story. We enjoy them for their story primarily. Compared to that, writing for a game is usually what game writers are invited for, because the first association when you say I'm writing for a game is like a fluff, like, okay, I do all kind of textual design for the game. So it's like providing a lore, or I don't know, some encyclopedia or some quest descriptions. Maybe it's a copy for games, like descriptions that are presented in a form of text. or item descriptions, spell descriptions, etc. And it's often separated from the game design, like completely. So in the pipeline, writers usually write without knowing the context of the game or the exact context where each element will appear in the game. But also game designers, like they create game design elements and then they just see that there will be some text there. So yeah, some call it fluff because it's like doesn't matter that much, but mostly because it's something like, you know, extra coming on after the game design decisions. But sadly, yeah, most of the time it's something that like is a second grade in sense that it's not as important as warranting hiring of like a full expert. So like anyone who can write can fill these roles. I also noticed that I did a blasphemous thing here. I put dialogues as a fluff, which is not where I would like it to be, as it's a very important aspect. But sadly, it's usually produced without firm connection to the game design, and it's treated like fluff. To me personally, dialogues are part of the characters as a narrative element, and that's very important. After all, we connect to the story and the game through the characters, and memorable characters are surely important, and they can engage the audiences. And dialogues are basically characters, interaction between characters in play, among other things, of course. So yeah, they're not only dialogues are not only there to provide characterization; they're also there to move the story forward, to provide the information. So yeah, they're sadly quite often very neglected in a game design process or game development process. So writing for a game is when game design elements are primary and the narrative is there because we are human beings. We are creatures of story. We perceive ourselves as the main characters in our story. So when there is a character involved in some action from our perspective, it's either a story or a beginning of a story. But also, this leads a lot of game developers, especially the producers, to think that characters can be torn out of the narrative context, that characters are sufficient as a narrative element. And I've seen many game devs showcasing their characters like, okay, this is what we draw, what do you think? And it's really hard to give any feedback because we don't know what's the context of this character, what's the story. So characters are important. And they can even be the cardinal element in the story, but alone they're not enough to provide for a narrative context. So when you're writing for a game, you need to see what narrative elements do you need, and what part of the game design they will connect to. So in writing a game, you start and you finish with crafting entire narrative, entire structure from A to Z. And in writing for a game, you can pick like, do you want to craft a theme and plot for this game, or do you need only characters crafted for the game? Of course, in the context of some something that's going on with inside the game. So, what are the episodes going to be? Is it going to be linear flowing story, or is it going to be node-based narration? Is it going to be some story bits that are connected in some way? Or, of course, like, is there world building? What kind of world building it is? How does it translate into a setting? And do you have any maps? And what kind of maps what kind of story your maps tell? Because it's very important to notice here that gameplay elements also narrate. And that's why narrative design is not just a design of text or arranging of this fluff, but the art of combining these game design elements and making them narrate as well as including the classical, so to speak, story elements. So yeah, the elements I've shown here for writing for a game are also used in writing a game, obviously. And you also need them to be part of the structure, and it's important how you combine them. In a writing for a game, or in writing a game with a story, the anchors are usually a bit different. So it's not the theme plot continuum is not primarily, but the pillars of fantasy are primary. Like, what do you want your players to experience, to feel? That's in focus. Also, the gameplay. Is more important, like the core loop. What are the action verbs? What is it the player does? So pillars of fantasy like tell you what do you want player to feel like, what do you want them to experience, why the a gameplay is like what the player does. For example, in a platformer, the action verbs are jump or move and jump. And I called these anchors because I would suggest that you use them as a compass, like as a pointers. Like you can get a lot of questions answered, a lot of questions about both narrative design and the game design. If you look back to these anchors and for example, if you ask yourself, does this character fit my game? Is this level well designed? Do we need the text or not? I always suggest to go back to the anchors and see how this new element fits between your end goals. So why the structures? Because structure matters. It defines how the individual elements are connected, and it gives the synergy to the game and story continuum. It creates something that's more than a mere sum of its parts. I mean, obviously, you know, graphite and diamonds made of same elements, the carbon, but how they are arranged gives them different properties and creates different, even different colors and everything else. So a good structure will add immense value to each individually crafted element, be it a game design element or the narrative element. And the bad structure at best can make the flaws visible, and at worst, of course, it can ruin the entire game. Also, something from my experience as a creative writing teacher, before I would be focused on teaching language and style, improving the writing skill of my students, but it didn't make them, it didn't help them make better stories. It just made them make nicely written ones, which is also important. But it's only when I started teaching structures that I noticed like almost 50% boost in the quality of individual stories. So what I want to say is that players are okay. They like your game. They play your game. They will be happy to see some content, written content as an element. But as long as the element itself is well implemented in a solid structure. Also, our perception is based on structures. So we follow patterns. If you show me a stick figure, then a stick figure with a booze and then a grave, I will think like, okay, this man drank himself to death. Maybe it's not the truth. Maybe I'm just guessing. Maybe it's like wild guess, but that's what the pattern tells me. That's what the pattern shows me. So these patterns are quite important, and that's why it's important to know the structures, because they create these patterns. But also, the structure is the way we perceive the stories. And that's why Aristotle's 3-point or a 5-point or whatever you want structure is still valid after like the thousands of years. The essence of a story is change. And for the change to make sense, we need to see how the elements interact, how are they arranged. The structure, especially in interactive, nonlinear stories, is very important, because if player picks little story beats and little story nodes and then reads on, plays on, combines the gameplay experience with the narrative experience, that's when they can start creating the pattern in their mind, and that's when they'll start thinking that, okay, this is not just a sequence of random fluff texts. It's just it creates a story. Also, by the way, I just want to point out that this 3-point structure or the hero journey are not the only structures in writing, especially because with interactive narration, many other structures came to existence and are very efficient for games, especially the semiotic square. Like, you know, we have Cinderella, who like at first doesn't look like a princess, is not princess, and then she looks like a princess but is not yet a princess, and then she goes back to not looking like a princess but she could be a princess because the prince is now interested in her, and then in the end she is the princess and looks like one. I'm saying it because it's very, very good for games, especially if you don't want your narrative to like oppress your gameplay. If you want to have like more gameplay and more game design elements and like a nicely fitting narrative on top of this. So I have a question for you. In this image, we see a narrative designer, a game designer, a game writer, producer, and lead developer. And you win 100 points if you tell me who's who. So the main problem which comes with narratives and game design is that they're usually quite separated in the pipeline. Also, there's not enough attention to the narratives and the writing, and it's not a point of ignorance or something. It's the problem of ubiquity of writing. So because we are the creatures of the story, we live inside the story, so to speak. So whoever thinks of themselves that they are imaginative, they're creative, they feel that they can write and they can write stories, and rightfully so. I mean, that's quite a correct assumption. It's just that the more we go in non-linearity and interactivity, then that's where the more in-depth narrative skills are necessary, but they're again not seen as something that important. So keeping track of the structures, I think, is not only important for writers and narrative designers, but also it can allow a better synergy between narrative and the game elements. And I will explain it to examples of 3 different games and how their structures were related to game design, and of course how I failed miserably when I tried to do it first time. So speaking of structures and maps, it's not easy to keep tabs on the narrative and game design. It's not, in fact, it's not even easy for a single author to keep track, because usually the narrative is novel-sized or bigger. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of words. Plus, there is more complications when it's connected to the game and the flow of the game. And then you have to keep track of a lot of things. And of course, that's why maps are important, not only to avoid bad narrative decisions, but also to avoid bad game design. And yeah, when I say maps, I don't mean only this kind of graphical interpretation of the data. I also mean like the every kind of format that tells you what's going on with this particular moment in narrative design. So if the structure is the key, then maps are the way. So yeah, keeping clarity at all times about what's going on in what segment and what aspect of your narrative. And so the structures, basically narrative structures represent the way the elements are arranged. So here, for example, we have different names and different terms for the same 3-act structure. So narrative structures basically tell us the order in which the story is told. And that's very important because in a linear, classical storytelling, the 3-point structure can give you a headache, but it's basically something we're all familiar with. And there's always like, you know, the good old rising action, the peak of the drama, and the falling action, or some variations of thereof. But when it comes to adding nonlinear and interactive elements in the story, then it gets quite more complicated. So basically, I mean, if we look at these 2 maps, they represent how the visual novel structures are formed. For example, the left one is about how, for example, the narrative-based visual novels are created, where the narrative stays this, where the player players' actions decide what kind of narrative there's going to be. So players' actions influence the outcome of the story. And to the right is, I call them character-based, where the events of the stories remain the same, and the character displays different attitudes or opinions, or person that develops some skills or something, and then ultimately the decisions are to where the story will go depend on what the character is like. So how will they behave in some moment of dramatic change. So in theory this looks fairly simple, but keep in mind that this is just like the simplest example of the graph. I mean, the red one is displaying like what's the common route of the story, what will always be the same. And then we have these sort of threads which represent some choices that are branching, but they're not story changing. So for example, in visual novels, there can be a lot of threads that affect the game flow and the episode layout, but they don't really change the story arc. They just sort of meander or move player here and there, but they keep the events of the narrative inside this main story or common route. And that's why this doesn't represent the actual episodes of the story. It just represents how the story changes and when the story changes. That's why we have this red line, and then branch 1, 2, 3, different colored, depends on how the story dramatically changes from the core loop. So when the player plays through, they can reach it's like 6 different endings, 2 per branch, but they will always play the same main route. This is a bit more complex, because when it comes to episode structures, that it can get really wild, in sense that this structure is like keeping flow of the episodes from one episode to the other. And you can see the red, green, and yellow pills, and they sort of represent, the ending. Like, okay, this is the bad ending. The green is the good ending, and yellow is like meh ending, not really fun. So yeah, when it comes to the episodes, it's really important to keep track of what episodes combine, what episodes are part of the same cluster. Like in here, it's color coded by this purple, orange, light blue, beige colors. So yeah, if you decide to go keeping track of the game flow, it can be, but it doesn't have to be connected to the episodes, because within each of these squares representing episodes, we can have different levels or different locations. So, for example, here is like a more close-up view of something that could be a game flow map, and it's not something that represents the core loop in algorithmic fashion. So this is like more like, okay, how the player moves through the game, and it can represent locations or game areas, but it can also represent the areas of the story. And it's very important and very good for mapping adventure games or the narrative games where the plot structure is highly interactive. So in fact, when the player encounters a collage of different situations, and then slowly it becomes a coherent narrative in players' minds as they piece together the elements of the story. So why is this map very useful? Because it can be easily transformed into something I call the player perception map. And basically, it's like a layer built on top, where we can display what kind of elements in the story player knows, or what story elements the player triggers. So this, for example, if we have a blue as a beginning, and then the player moves through these locations or episodes or parts of the story, we can have like this introductory squares. So the squares are marked with I, are sort of like where the introduction still happens, and then the E ones can be something like where the exposition is going on, when some further developments are happening. And then we can have a map that shows us, for example, that either in order to reach some area, you need to go through the gate of unlocking the previous ones, which enables you to keep, of course, the track of what player knows and what player learned, so that there is no disjointment. But it can also be used to keep track of what player knows, so that you can have like the same location but two different text displayed in sense of like what player already experienced, if you want to keep track of that. So these maps of player perception for me are particularly interesting because quite simple layouts of episodes can be tracked as a very exciting narratives, and it can provide like a simple plot structure with more complex gameplay experience, because you can have like basic number of locations but quite a big number of layers in sense of like what player perceives at which point. And it's also very important for development of the stories, because some stories are sort of their peak leans towards the end, so there is like a lot of build up and requires a lot of build up, and some stories are can happen like towards the middle and then have long sequence of like fails and retries and like even several peaks. So that's why I always like, I'm so excited about these perception maps. But as I said, the map doesn't have to be like a totally graphical representation in sense of a map. It can be a list of items that you need to display early on, so that they like later explode. Because of course, in constructing a narrative, it's quite important to have these moments when you plan something quite early, and then wow, it becomes very important later. It's also important to keep track of like dependencies, because believe it or not, making a structure of narration is not really so different than programming, because you have to code the perception of the reader, you have to code the perception of the audience, you have to slowly go from initialization of like in the beginning of the program, you initialize all the variables and then you can operate with them. The same is with the player's perception. You give them like a little information that are important for them to understand the story, but also important for them to later make some decisions. For example, in here is the excerpt from an interactive fiction game called The Land of No Twilight, being made by Clara Raškaj, and it's one of the 3 games I'm gonna finally present to you. But before I do, so we have this introduction, exposition, first challenge, second challenge, like some sort of game story stations in her game, and then we have some list of some items which are important to notify the player that this is where this information has to come in play, or otherwise there will be problems later. So speaking of the games, the first one I want to talk about is Land of No Twilight. It's being made by erotic fiction writer and game designer Clara Raškaj from Croatia. It's a romance game with fantasy elements, and it's delivered in a format of interactive fiction, which means that reading is a gameplay, and basically the player's choices will be the only and the basic gameplay elements. So the game is played by reading and making choices, and since it relies more on the story than on the game design elements, the composition of choice stations is very important, and also values collected from these choices, because pacing and relevance of choices are basically what her game design task is. So in order to make this not just like a reading experience for the player, but also a playing experience, she needs to see how to combine her writing and the pace of her story into a sequence of interesting choice stations, so that they're not like too few or too many. Because if they're too few, of course, the players get impatient to make decisions, because playing a game is like making interesting decisions. And also not to have too many, because then the player sort of sees through that they don't have really impact on the story, and they can get disappointed because they just bring meaningless or less meaningful decisions. Her anchors were rooted in her personal motivation, her personal why. So she wanted to talk about prejudices and groups of people who are distrustful for each other. So she was mostly being propelled by her inner motive, what I call the scream. Then she came to the front theme, like old versus young, the wisdom of old versus the impatience of the young, and the deeper theme, like something that player actually discovers while reading, while playing in front with this front theme. And these are so it's like prejudice is born of lack of understanding and lack of communication. So it was really important for her, and it was refined into these themes, which make the basis of her game. So the plot is quite simple, in the sense that there's a young upstart girl, and she's not happy with the current kings of her realm. They have like two co-rulers, Sun King and the Moon King, and she wants to challenge them both to a ritualistic challenge that will test her ability and skill and wits, and the outcomes are varied, of course, with romance options to date one or both kings. So the main challenge here for her was to tell a coherent story with different outcomes while preserving the integrity of the theme and plot in each of the branches, as well as to craft meaningful choices that will, create the gameplay elements for her. Of course, her story is not set in a typical fantasy kingdom. It's like the people are day people or night people. They are plants. They have this sort of plant-like qualities. So it adds another layer of narrative that she needs to explain to the players, and to sort of also use these differences to play with. So common mistake in this kind of game is like to harass the player with either uninformed or irrelevant choices, or to preserve the illusion that there is some action because you're making decisions. So for this game, I was a narrative design teacher and writing coach, and yeah, it's still under construction. Second game I want to present is Let Bygones Be Bygones by George Markovic. He's doing game development as a part of Bohemian Pulp, which is like a sort of solo developer studio. Like, he's not entirely one-man show, but he's bootstrapped and he's a solo endeavor. You can find him on Patreon as well. So he wanted to, I was also game design consultant for this one and narrative design teacher. This is what the game looks like currently. And as you can see, it's very cool pixel art. It was inspired by LucasArts games. And he decided not to have any inventory puzzles. So it's like it plays like a point-and-click adventure with where you click, your avatar moves. But the focus is on narrative, and the action progresses through the narrative choices. The main challenge here was that his game didn't have any strong theme. He was more reliant on the plot. Like, he wanted stuff to happen. He wanted cool stuff implemented. But then the plot was all over the place. He didn't have any clear ideas where it has to go. So the problem was that the elements he crafted, locations he invented, episodes and characters were quite disjointed. They didn't tell a coherent story, and also he didn't have any planning of the structure. And it's really bad, because when you don't plan the structure of a story, then you can accidentally tell a story you don't really want. And I don't want to go into details with this, but it does happen even to the best of writers, if they don't really carefully plan out things, that they think they're delivering one story and it's completely different. So So the story is important, the structure of the story is important because it does lead to players' perception. It does ensure that you can deliver the message and the idea that you want clearly and exactly and precisely. So it's a futuristic noir story with click and point gameplay and a strong narrative focus, and his anchors were quite vague and not really fixed in either the theme or the pillars of fantasy. So he just wanted to make a pixel art, LucasArts style game. He wanted it to be cyberpunk, a detective noir, and he wanted to have one of the characters as a Bion, which is artificial life form, like a robot. So when we met, he had some messy story in place, and he didn't have any narrative structure. And quite interesting thing for me is that only when we set the whole structure and when he was able to see how the things mapped out, then only it was when he reworked the plot and discovered actually what his theme is. And the problem is that he had this typical dilemma of an author that like he knows where he wants to be kind of, but he doesn't see the road to it. So he came up with like a story which he's not sure what the player will do inside of it. So that was the game design challenge for him. Like he had some elements and some ideas what the story should be like, but then it left them without any ideas what the players will actually do. And the last game I want to present is the Quartermaster or Uprising, which I created, and it started as a craft jam game jam project. And I called it the Tactical Quartermaster Simulation because this is from the jam version. The idea came to me while I was playing a lot of XCOM, and I wondered like, hey, these soldiers, they're so cool, but what would the people who cook for them? What the people who wash their clothes? Like, oh no, the mutant blood all over again. And so I was like, what if the players in the role of quartermaster, someone responsible for the supplies? What if like you can cook the buffs instead of cast spells? Or what if the player is completely in this supporting role? So this is a screen from a game jam version, of course, obviously made in RenPy. And so I made it in such a way that player has control over the game and over his squad, as long as the morale is not disaster, and the morale, of course, heavily influenced by hunger. So if he keeps everyone fed, then they keep fighting, then keep moving, and of course, if the player cannot feed them, then they slowly desert and run away. So basically, the anchors of this game were pillars of fantasy, where I wanted the player to be in a support role, never directly contributing to the action, which kind of I failed later. And then from then on, I started thinking about what kind of theme I can create to sort of tie the game together. And then I came up with like a new version titled Uprising, where the player will be in charge of like totally incompetent rebels, rebels who are like whining that they don't have enough gluten-free food on this trip or something like that. So my theme was like, okay, heroes are not those who die, but those who keep us still alive. And the army only marches on its full stomach, like Napoleon said, I think something. So the player is like the chef or a quartermaster, supply master for a group of rebels, and they need to run from one side of the map to the other, and they're being pursued, and there's some MacGuffin that they have to protect. It was inspired quite heavily by Faster Than Light and Jack Smith, who won very old Flash game, as well as old Amiga game Lost Patrol. So I wanted to keep the narrative important and sort of like a cloud above the game design, but I did want game design to come first, and I wanted this sort of support to be important. So I saw the action delivered in style of Crying Sun, when you don't really interact with the action, and I wanted like more inventory juggling, like in the Sword of the Stars, the Pit, when it's not the lack of ingredients that bothers you, but the abundance of ingredients. You have to like make sure, what do you want to discard, what do you want to keep, do you want to make something quick and easy now, or save up for the more powerful recipe. Yeah, so yeah, I failed that, but let me first tell you about let bygones be bygones. So this is the story timeline. As you can see, it's very linear, very fixed. This is the what happens, what goes on in the story. So he has a robot girl or some biological robot Bion. She escapes from some rich place above and joins the pit, the dark and noir area, and then she goes to Inferno, some party, some club in this down under city, and then she runs away, disappears. And then Lady D from the nobility, she hires this detective Cooper, that's the player, and then he starts investigation. She's hijacked and sold at the black market. He doesn't know that. He's just bungling around, then gets drugged, doesn't progress at all. In the meantime, she's abused in some VIP, very decadent show, where she, goes crazy, kills everyone, then runs away to the preacher, and she passes out there. And then detective discovers the massacre, learns about her being dismantled. He hunts down the perps, and only to see her being stolen, her body dumped. He tries to save her somehow, retrieving her head, and so on. So on. I don't want to, clog you with this, but it's a really straightforward stories timeline. And the plot structure is also quite simple. So we have a prologue where we meet the landlord, and it's like a tutorial for the game. Then there is a little flashback that connects the player with the character, explains what are the trouble of the character. Then we have the introduction where the game actually starts and the player starts exploring a bit. Then we have chapters where what first chapter is meant to be an exposition, further development of the story, and the chapter 2 is meant to be the main episode, the main story. So in chapter 1, the player is tracking Lucy's movements, checking out where she went, trying to patch the clues together. Then he's introduced to a list of suspects, he's gathering clues, and then there's more flashback to propel his own personal story. And yeah, in the chapter 2, there's a pace up, picks up a bit when he's racing to save the girl, fails, and then the whole race sort of calms before the storm in the third chapter. So the main trouble for the game developer here was okay, but what will the player do? How will I keep this interesting from the playing perspective? Because he did want a narrative game with strong narrative elements, but he was also struggling with how to find actions for the player which will not be puzzles, which will not be inventory puzzles, which will he wanted to have this sort of flow of the game where player will always know where to go and what to do, or at least have options to find out quite quickly. But he wasn't sure what the player will do inside the game. So basically, we drafted a game flow map which keeps track of locations, and we sort of aligned these locations with the narrative structure. Okay, this is the prologue. In prologue, we will have the office where the action take place, and then the old office in the flashback sequence. Then in introduction, we'll also again have the players only limited to the office, because we don't expand the story and the gameplay so much. Then we have the chapter 1 where the player basically can speed run. They can go from the office directly to the Inferno, ask questions there, and then go to the pub where the story is bottlenecked. Because of course he wanted to have some sort of control over the story and over the narrative, so not to let the player reach the final, the ultimate levels immediately, of course. But so in order to have this kind of more in-depth gameplay, we decided to create more locations and to seed these locations not with puzzles, but with scenes, with little interactions that the player can do. And these interactions combine some choices presented in an interactive fiction, but also some little inventory, take a bowl of soup, give it to Granny, or take the gun, drop the gun. So the inventory is limited because he didn't want to make puzzles. So the game flow doesn't stop the events of the story. The player can choose either to visit all and explore the all, or to slowly, move towards the part of the game where the story will continue. And you can say like, okay, so what's the big deal? I mean, this is quite obvious, but when the creator starts creating, especially if they don't have a clarity about what they want to achieve, these things are not easy to see. I mean, when you display it like this, it's like, okay, obvious, it's clear and obvious. But when you're making a story and you're making a game, quite a lot of stuff is simply you're like scuba diving through the river, murky river water. You don't see what's what. So basically, we wanted to have the chance for player to customize their own story and experience, to really explore, but also to have the chance to, find further story and go on. It's almost completely the reversed in the Uprising example, because the player basically has to, it's a small game where player has to reach from one top to the other. And here, the narrative relies on unifying theme. So the story is not linearly connected. It's each cell of this map tells a little bit of a story, which is like repeated all over the place. So basically, the blue dots represents what happens if player follows the route directly to the end, and stories that appear in this blue line are unified with the theme. So it's like mostly about the rebels complaining and complaining about their life, or how difficult it is to rise up in uprising, or how difficult it is to survive. And because the gameplay verbs, the action verbs that I wanted to use were forage, cook, fry, eat raw, feed. So I wanted to be a strong interaction between verbs of the game design and the events. To create more emergent feel of the narrative. So there's no linear story. The blue dots are not representing one story arc, but like a group of little interactions and little dialogues that feed into this theme and into this idea. So the green ones are a little bit more radical, like more radical event can happen, but again in the same theme. The yellow one, the orange ones represent like an introductory events, and the red dots are like extreme versions of the narrative. And so yeah, I hoped to create this game design first approach where the narrative will like come on top, and it didn't work exactly, because as a narrative, it worked well because I had this unifying theme which held it strong together. But the gameplay, it turned out I do need to learn more about game design, or at least redesign this game. Namely, I couldn't really make the player's action be reasonably limited to only cooking and support words. But I was forced to add the classical tactical options like move, scout, attack, and then the outcome. Because the player is not in the role of a hero, the outcome is not in the player's hands. So the player will order for attack to commence, but they will not command it. They will not have any influence on it, except in a way that wasn't clear for the player how is it connected. So basically, I didn't want to give up on the narrative part. I didn't want it to be just fluff, but in essence, I had to rework the core loop to make it both more connected to the narrative and also to correspond to the pillars of the game, because I didn't want for player to be a hero or like a demi-hero. I really want to put him in a support. And did it work? Well, stay tuned because it's still work in progress, but I have some I've come with some ideas and solutions how to make the player sort of decide where and what's gonna happen with the action part by crafting and cooking appropriate stuff. But yeah, it's still raw. What's important take here is that starting from narrative, I created a game design idea which then get coated in the narrative. Then the narrative became very interesting and important, and then it gave rise to, okay, this is not going to work because I'm not being true to either the pillars of the game or the theme, and it helped me like, okay, scrap this. I don't want to continue working in this action tactical part, because then I will move away too far from the pillar of the game. So I had to like, okay, sit back and do it again, which I probably wouldn't be able to notice if I was just taking a feedback from players, because players liked it. They're like, okay, I can do this, I can do that, and it made sense to them. But it didn't sense to me as an author. I didn't want this actually to happen. And compared to the previous games, we have a game flow of Land of No Twilight, and it seems quite simple. As you see, mostly like linear stuff happening like one after the other, and and then if we see the plot, it's quite simple and quite similar. Like, okay, the story follows the plot structure, but she wanted to have 6 different endings. Basically, 2 are win or lose, and 3 are determined like who do you end up with in romantic sense. And basically, she had a lot of story and little gameplay. So basically, we decided to make the episode structure apparent and see, okay, what kind of episodes do we have for each plot structure. So we have a plot structure of prologue, beginning, exposition, the main episodes, peak of drama, and endings. And then it was really important to see, okay, so our story, overarching plot is maybe very simple, but it does provide for quite interesting customization, because in a map of values, we were able to determine which episodes will outcome of which episodes will be like, do you move towards the day king or the night king? Are you more affiliated with the day workers culture or night workers culture? But also like, do you more opt for respect or love, which is this green and red maps? And then in the end, the player could really live with their decisions. That's very important, because in this kind of game, the choices are what a game design is. So if the player is like, I'm not sure, I'll save and then try the other choice, then it's you failed in a game design, not necessarily in a story writing. But with this maps, we managed to see, okay, so we want to create choices that players will stick by, live by strongly, and it was possible because then we were able to see how the maps of values lay over the episodes map, and how does it fit the relatively simple structure to create quite interesting gameplay, which is like meandering and really providing a lot of customizations. So thank you for your attention. I hope I managed to explain that narrative structures are very important, and that they can keep track not only of the story and the story element, but help you craft better games that are more consistent to the narrative, because they're not only keeping a track of what's happening in the story, but they can immensely help you in game design decisions. They can help story games become better designed, or game design improved. You can help you reorient yourself, stick to your pillars of fantasy, define your pillars of fantasy, and yeah, I mean, and all three games were made by a single author. So imagine a hot mess when it's like 7 producers and 3 game developers and 5 game writers, and no one's connected in a pipeline. So yeah, thank you. Questions? How to deal with long narrative storytelling in live service games? Assumption that have a set ending. Yeah, well, with the long narrative in live service games, it shouldn't be about the plot, because as you see, the plots are like a fixed thing, and it's something that is has to have the ending. And if you produce another and another and another, you get into this trap of making a TV show that's like going endlessly. So for live service games, I would stick with themes, and I think most of the live service games sort of gets this right, because they have this like seasonal themed content. It doesn't have to be seasonal in the sense of like, oh, let's make a Halloween episode for our live service game, but it can be derived from strong themes that the gameplay or game design sets. What's the best app for case story for the game? Well, Best app from my point of view is the one you feel most comfortable with. I suggest RTC because I really liked how the database is visualized and how you can really make a lot of these crude maps quite sophisticated in it. But it's I think the most the one you feel most comfortable is the best. How to build a story about two heroes in the middle of the digital story? Which story template should we choose? How to build a story about two heroes that meet in the middle? Well, I would suggest you craft it as a regular story, like what's your plot, what's your theme, what do you want to say, and then create two independent arcs. It's just that the player doesn't encounter the arc after the start. It's that the player plays through first one arc, then the other arc, and then they meet in the middle, if I understood correctly. Because if they if you want player to experience both sides, then I would sort of make the game start from two starts and then meet in the middle, but they have to be unified with the further plot and the theme of a story. So what do you want to say? Yeah, okay. Good. Okay. Okay, so I can stop sharing.